Good morning and welcome to this, the third meeting of 2014 of the European External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that mobile phones are switched off, please? Can I welcome to the table Dr Daniel Keneally, again, who's the advisor to the committee on our inquiry and the aspects of the Scottish Government's white paper relating to the European Union. Can I also welcome today the winners of the Audio Europa competition. The competition was organised by the Scottish Youth Parliament. I see a few well-kent faces in the audience. Welcome. This was organised by the European Parliament office in Edinburgh, and it had been designed to give young people across Scotland the chance to share their views on why it's important to vote in the European elections. And you will all get a chance to meet the committee in a brief recess we're having after the evidence session this morning, so we'll look forward to that. And we'll move on. We have no apologies for committee at present at all. And the first agenda item is a decision on taking business in private, and it's the first item to seek the agreement to take item 4 in private. And our discussions agreed. Excellent. Moving on to agenda item 2, and we are continuing our inquiry today. So the main item today in the agenda is the committee's inquiry into the Scottish Government's proposals for an independent Scotland and its membership of the European Union. We have one witness today, so you're in the hot seat, Mr Avery. We have Graham Avery, and we will continue really where we left off last week. Mr Avery, I believe you have an opening statement, but I'm just going to give you a wee brief introduction. So today with us we have Graham Avery, the Senior Member of St Anthony's College, Oxford University, Senior Advisor to the European Policy Centre in Brussels, and Honorary Director General of the European Commission. Welcome, sir, to committee this morning. And can I thank you for your written submission, which has caused a wee flutter of attention, I think. So we're looking forward to your evidence this morning. And I believe you have an opening statement you would like to give the committee.
Yes, Madam Convener and members of the committee, thanks for your welcome, and I'm very pleased to share my views with you today. I'm not going to repeat the written evidence that you've got in front of you, but I'd just like to explain, if I may, my approach to this question of how Scotland would join the European Union if its people vote for independence in September. And I want to underline that on this question of Scottish independence, I try to remain neutral. I was born in Wales. My mother was Welsh, so believe me, I'm Welsh. My father was English, and he was a minister in the Methodist Church, and his last 2 circuits were here in Scotland, so I've lived for a few years in this country, and I have lots of affection for Scotland. Anyway, after some years working in London in the British government service, I spent most of my professional life in the European Commission in Brussels, from which I retired 8 years ago, and I am no longer employed by or represent the European Commission. I'm sorry to say that we Welsh, like you Scots, we're constantly described by foreigners as English. So in self-defence, I usually say my nationality is Welsh, my passport is British, my citizenship is European, and these 3 strands of my identity, they're not conflictual, they reinforce each other. Anyway, I want to insist that although my point of view, as expressed in my written evidence, is similar to that of the Scottish Government on the question of procedure, how to join the European Union, and although I believe strongly that it would be in the interest of an independent Scotland to be in the European Union, I don't have a personal view on the question of whether Scotland should be independent. That's for the people of Scotland to decide, and I don't think you need advice from outsiders like me. Let me just explain how I got involved in this question of Scottish independence. 2 years ago, when I was listening and reading to what senior figures in London were saying and writing about Scottish independence, I got quite perplexed. They were saying that an independent Scotland would first have to leave the European Union and then apply for membership and spend some time coming back in. And this seemed to me absurd. During my career as a public servant, I had a lot of experience in the enlargement of the European Union. I was a junior member of the British team many years ago that negotiated British membership. And later in Brussels, I took part in one way or another in every round of enlargement that brought in the different countries. And if I have any claim to expertise, it's on how to join the European Union. And if I have any claim to be in the Guinness Book of Records, It's because I wrote the Commission's opinions on the membership applications of 14 different countries and drafted the general negotiating framework that's been used by the EU in 19 accession negotiations. Excuse me for saying all this about myself, but I think it's useful to you understand where I'm coming from. Anyway, when I listened to these arguments that in order to join the European Union, Scotland would have to leave the EU and apply for membership and spend several years trying to get back in, I thought this is absurd, both from the political point of view and the practical point of view. It also was accompanied by other arguments which seemed to me to portray the European Union as a huge obstacle to Scottish independence. It's obvious that the common sense solution would be for Scotland's membership of the European Union to be effective on the same day as its independence. And it's obvious that you shouldn't treat 5 million Scottish citizens who've been European citizens for 40 years in the same way as you treat people of non-member countries, or third countries as they're called in the Euro jargon. So in September 2012, in the interests of injecting a bit of common sense in the debate, I submitted a memorandum to the House of Commons in London, and it's that evidence which you have as an annex to my written evidence. I used to describe my approach to this question of Scotland joining the European Union as the common sense solution, but it's now known more generally and more prosaically as the Article 48 solution. Let me add finally that I'm not a lawyer. I was a policy advisor. I worked for many politicians, and I acquired a good deal of experience of how politics works, particularly the politics of the European Union and the practical realities of international negotiations. And this has led me to analyse questions like Scottish independence on the basis of interests. Let me put it this way. When you prepare for a negotiation of this kind, you shouldn't spend too much time listening to what the other party says. You should try to figure out what his or her real interests are, because it's interest that will determine the outcome of the negotiations. As far as lawyers are concerned, and you've heard a number of lawyers in your sessions, they're there to help, but they're not there to decide. Law is very important for the European Union. Without the treaties and the legislation that flows from them, the EU couldn't function. But when it comes to important decisions, the EU's leaders, they take decisions on what to do on the basis of practical considerations and national and European interests. And then they ask the lawyers to put them into legal shape. Madam Convener, I think I should stop here. I don't want to explain all again about Article 48 and 49. I see from the reports of your earlier sessions that your committee is on the way to getting an unrivaled knowledge of Articles 48 and 49. But I'll just mention one other point, one other topic, if I may, that isn't covered by my written evidence, but perhaps I could share my views with you if you want. It's the question whether Scottish independence is a good thing or a bad thing for the European Union. I mean, a lot of effort is being devoted naturally to the question whether independence is good or bad for Scotland. And in London, there's a lot of analysis of whether it's good for the rest of the United Kingdom. And no one really seems to have addressed the question, is it good for the European Union as such? I've tried to reflect a bit on this, and at an appropriate moment, perhaps I could share my ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interested to hear your point about interests will determine the outcome of any negotiation, and look at the interests of the people that you're negotiating with in a general sense. One of the questions that I'd asked the lawyers last week, and it's one that's of particular interest to myself, is the relevance of Article 2, given that Article 2 is about reflecting democracy, and the will of the people of a nation, and you know, the right to free trade, the right to free movement of workers, and all of the aspects that make up that treaty. And I was wondering if you could maybe give us an insight on how you think Article 2 would maybe reflect in any negotiations that would take place in the future.
Well, be a bit careful asking me these legal questions, because I'm not a lawyer. That's not my pay grade. But to reply to your question, Article 2 is not a legal basis for action under the treaty. It's a set of principles, and they're good and solid principles. They don't include the principle of self-determination. I mean, the treaties are silent on this question which we're discussing, which is the idea that one part of a member state would become independent from the member state. So I think the principles that the treaty mentions of mutual cooperation and acting in good faith, they're important, but the legal basis is the procedural question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go to open questions to committee colleagues. Rod Campbell.
Good morning, Mr. Avery. Perhaps I could begin by just kicking off with something which is touched on in your response to the first question. In relation to Article 48, you say that, yes, in your view, negotiations on the terms of Scottish membership should take place in the period following the referendum and before the date of independence. Last week, when we heard from the 4 lawyers, although there was a difference of opinion as to whether Article 48 or 49 was appropriate, at least 3 out of the 4 lawyers said that negotiations could commence following the referendum. And indeed, Professor Armstrong also seemed to accept that there was, as Sir David Edwards said, good faith obligations in that respect. So we had a kind of reasonable unanimity last week on this question of negotiations. But perhaps you could give us a flavour from the political point of view as how you would foresee these negotiations developing.
Well, I've always said that obviously Scotland would have to apply for membership. And plainly, you can't apply formally as a state for membership of the European Union until after you're independent. But it's equally clear to me that there are less formal ways of applying for membership, and I imagine that the day after the referendum, if the answer is yes, the Scottish Government would write a letter saying, we want to begin these negotiations. As I think you know very well, intergovernmental negotiations and indeed decisions in the European Union in the period we're talking about before Scottish independence, Scotland wouldn't have a direct voice. So Scotland's request for the opening of some kind of negotiations would be conveyed to the member states, and there would be a discussion in the Council of Ministers and maybe the European Council on how to proceed. My guess is that they would ask the Commission to present some ideas, maybe even an opinion on Scottish membership. The European Commission can be asked to give an opinion at any time on practically anything. You don't have to do that under Article 49. But for me, the crucial political, practical question, which would have to be addressed quite soon after the referendum, is it the aim of the European Union for Scotland's independence to coincide with its membership of the European Union, or do we conceive another approach where Scotland would have to leave and come back in? That's the basic practical question. As far as the negotiations are concerned, my view, which I explained in the paper, is that the other member states really wouldn't be very interested in delving deeply into the technical questions of Scotland's application of the so-called acquis of the European Union. You know, the 80,000 pages. After all, you already apply them, and I think, therefore, that they wouldn't want to sit around a table with 28 government representatives looking into all that for a period of 5 or 6 years, as they do with ordinary candidatures. So I think the procedure could be a simplified one, under which, of course, is a very important question: how would the views of Scotland be taken into account, given that in this period before independence you don't have a seat in the institutions? Of course, you have Scottish members of the European Parliament, but you don't have a seat in the Council of Ministers of the European Council. It's clear to me that just as they did in the case of German reunification, they would ensure effective means whereby the Scottish Government could be consulted at every stage of the process. In the case of German reunification, the Commission had talks not only with Bonn, which is the capital of the Federal Republic, but with the people in Berlin. So I'm quite sure that whatever package they came up with, they would be scrupulously careful to ensure that Scotland's views were taken into account. Then there would have to be a modification of the treaty. It's sometimes not well understood that the modification of the treaties that you need for the accession of a country is quite brief. I mean, it's only 3 or 4 articles. There's a massive annex about the secondary legislation, but the treaty as such, it's an extremely simple document. You'd need, in a treaty allowing Scotland to join the EU on the first day of independence, one of the basic things you'd need to do is to provide for Scotland seats in the EU institutions. After all, that's the most important thing you get with membership of the European Union. It's not just the money from Brussels, it's a seat and a direct say in the decision-making. How long would this ratification take place? It's very difficult to predict, but given that, in my analysis, Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union is not a controversial question among the member states, I think they could ratify such a treaty quite rapidly.
Perhaps just moving on slightly from that in terms of negotiations to the point you made at the end of your opening statement. Do you believe that it's in the interest of the rest of the European Union for Scotland to become or to continue to be a member of the European Union?
Okay, we're talking here about the European Union as such, not this or that member state, because of course they can have different opinions, and I think there are several ways in which you can address this question. I mean, let's be clear that this is a different question from the question of how Scotland would join the European Union. We're talking about the basic question here of whether it should join.
That it might be the background to negotiations. If you're keen on retaining Scotland in the European Union, it would influence the negotiations, would it not, in political terms?
Well, as far as I can see, no member state is opposed in principle to the idea that Scotland should join the European Union if its people vote for independence. I mean, I haven't encountered anyone in government anywhere who takes that view, neither in Spain nor in London. There is a question about how, but on the ultimatum, I haven't met anyone who's against Scotland being or remaining in the European Union.
Angela?
Good morning, and thank you very much for your opening remarks. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, if I may, and may I start off by saying that I respect your knowledge in this area. It's, you come with an incredible background, which is very valuable to us. You say in your written statement that the agreement of joining could take from 2 to 3 years. And you also say something which is probably a very popular view in some political circles, that membership could happen the same day as Scotland declared itself independent, if that happened. The two don't tie up very neatly, because I think there will surely be issues in regards to what currency ultimately Scotland would use and how the European Union would perceive that. And also, there was well, I'll ask the second part once you've had an opportunity to address this.
Okay, to be correct, I don't think in my evidence I said it would take 2 or 3 years. I think in my evidence I said that the process of negotiating membership between the referendum and the date of independence would take not more than 1 or 2 years. Subsequently, the Scottish Government has fixed on 18 months, and my view is that that's tough but realistic. I think I also quote some figures for how long other people have taken in this process, and I quote the figure that in Finland holds the record, so to speak, for the most rapid accession, and it took them 31 months from the day of their application to the day of their membership. And this was Finland, Article 49 from outside. But within these 31 months, only 13 months were required to open the negotiations, properly speaking, and sign a treaty. In fact, it was less than 12 months for the negotiations, properly speaking. So, in my view, 18 months is a realistic figure for the time span you need to sort out all these questions. Of course, the questions that you mention, currency questions, and of course there's the question of the budget as well. They're difficult questions, and they didn't arise, at least not in the same form, in the case of Finland. There were other problems with Finland, but I don't believe, with a goodwill, that it's impossible to solve those problems in a period of 18 months.
Yes, I would agree that if there was a will, then perhaps that would be realistic. But going back to the important question about the European Union's opinion, I mean, I know that's a difficult call, but I think with your experience, you might be able to share some insight, because you already have, in a way, that you've not come across any opposition to Scotland joining the European Union, and I would probably agree with that sentiment. However, I think the European Union will also have to weigh up the issue about other areas within the European Union wanting to break up as well, and they will clearly want to take that into account. Taking that scenario, whilst you clearly say that there is no visible opposition from Spain and London, I'm just wondering, end of the day, might is right, and the Germans are very strong in the European Union. How would they perceive that with their fellow members in new applications or breakup of many of the countries within the European Union? And would they want to stomach that? Is there a will to stomach that at this stage?
Well, of course, I can't speak for the Germans. I can predict, if you like, and it's the same for Spain and London. I mean, let's begin with London and Madrid. As far as I understand it, the position of the British government is that if Scotland votes for independence, they wouldn't try to stop you joining the European Union. And it's pretty obvious, if you think about it for a moment, that it's manifestly in the interests of the rest of the United Kingdom for Scotland to be a member of the European Union on the first day of independence. Otherwise, the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom could become quite chaotic. And so my argument is that if there's one member state which above all will want the use of Article 48, it's the rest of the United Kingdom. And as I think I say in my evidence, I would predict that if the result of the referendum is yes, London will become a vigorous advocate of the use of Article 48. Let's look at Spain. Again, we all know that the Spanish government in Madrid is very concerned about independentism, and it's more than Catalonia, because there's the Basques as well. But my view is that Spain also has every interest in Scotland joining the European Union on independence and not staying outside. To take the fisheries policy, for example, I mean, in Madrid, they surely reflect that it wouldn't be very interesting or amusing for Spain if, on the day of independence, the common fisheries policy no longer applies. And then there's the question also of the Scottish budget contribution. Excuse me mentioning these vulgar things, but I'm talking about interests. Now, I often say to my Spanish friends, your problem in Madrid, it's not with Edinburgh, your problem is with London, because London agreed with Edinburgh to have this constitutional referendum process. Whereas in Spain, the government of Madrid say, quite simply, such a referendum and independence of Catalonia is against the constitution. As you probably know, the Spanish constitution says, I'll just quote the bit which it says, the constitution is based on the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation, the common and indivisible homeland of all Spaniards. This is quite strong language, indissoluble, indivisible. I'm not going to go any further into the Spanish debate, but basically the Spanish situation is a result of their constitution. And my argument has always been that the European Union scrupulously respects the constitutional arrangements and procedures of its member states. If, I hope it doesn't happen, but if there was a unilateral declaration of independence on the part of Catalonia, it's pretty clear to me that the rest of the European Union simply wouldn't recognise it. And actually, for the rest of the European Union, in such a scenario, Catalonia would still be in the European Union. So I think, as far as the Spanish is concerned, it's not really a problem for them that Scotland joins the European Union, because their argument vis-à-vis their regions is a different one. Now, I'm not naive. The Spanish won't make it easy, but I think when the moment of decision comes, they'll take a decision on the basis of their own interests.
Small point. That was helpful. The last question I would ask for you to give an opinion on is that between the time of a yes vote and Scotland actually going independent, if that time scale increases without membership of the European Union, we were given a scenario that could hurt our industry. What's your opinion on that?
I don't think the European Union as such would have a very strong opinion on that. As I've understood it, but excuse me, this is a political matter for you, the date of, March 1916 is related to the next elections in Scotland. So I don't think I should say too much about this variability of the date of independence, except to say that I don't think it's of huge importance from the point of view of the other member states.
Thank you very much.
Claire Adamson.
Just a quick supplementary in your comments about the Constitution, Mr. Avery. Could you give an opinion as to how significant the Edinburgh Agreement is in terms of the constitutional arrangements in the UK leading up to the referendum and post-referendum and the negotiation period at that time, where the UK government remains the member state?
To be honest, I'm not really sure I have an opinion on that and what you might call the British Constitution, which, as we know, isn't written. I think I would limit myself to saying, and repeat, that it's the practice of the European Union to respect the constitutional arrangements of member states. And up to now, I haven't noticed any government saying that they dispute the right of the United Kingdom to have this referendum. There may be views on how an independent Scotland would join, but no one has disputed that what has been agreed between London and Edinburgh is constitutionally okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Jimmy McGregor. Jimmy.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Mr. Avery, I bow to your superior knowledge on Europe. I'm a Conservative and would never be described as a Eurosceptic Conservative, which is where I'm coming from. But the purpose of our committee is to try and ascertain how easy it would be or how difficult it would be for Scotland to stay in the European Union or rejoin the European Union, so that people, when they come to vote at the referendum, have a clear picture. And what worries me to some extent is last week's session, when we had the 4 lawyers, and in my view 3 of them were saying you'd have to use Article 49. One was saying no, 48 would be all right. Now, looking at the timescales So that's the first question, really. That it's not a question of, well, it'll be all right on the night. It's going to be down to legal issues. And the second point is that whereas you did say that Finland joined very quickly, I mean, I'm just looking at the list I've got here of recent history of EU enlargement. From the beginning of negotiations to actual accession, Croatia took 8 years, Bulgaria 7, Romania 7, Lithuania 4, and then there's a whole lot of ones, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Estonia, Slovenia, all took 6 years. And the only 3 that I can see were Austria, Sweden and Finland, who took 2, or under 2 in Finland's case. So, I mean, in the question, I mean, for example, if it takes Bulgaria 7 years, how is Scotland going to achieve it in 18 months? That may be naive, but I'm just looking at this list.
Let me just make a comment on your last session, because I read the report and there were some very interesting discussions, and naturally I respect these eminent lawyers, but I have to tell you that nothing I read, I didn't find it any convincing argument that you couldn't use Article 48. I could accept that from a legal point of view, using Article 49 might be neater. But as I've said more than once, when it comes to important and difficult political decisions, the European Union has a habit, like national governments, of addressing the basic issues and deciding what's the best thing to do. My argument is that it's not in the interest of any member states to have this gap between independence and EU membership. So the length of time it's taken for third countries to join the European Union, in my humble opinion, isn't very relevant, because Scotland at the moment is in the European Union, and therefore a whole series of questions which you need to address with third countries are practically irrelevant in the case of Scotland. You know, do you need a detailed page-by-page examination of the 80,000 pages? Answer, no. Do you need an opinion on whether Scotland would fulfill the so-called Copenhagen criteria? You could ask the European Commission for an opinion on that, and I don't think that would be a very difficult or lengthy task, because Scotland is in the European Union. So I still persist in thinking that 18 months, although quite tough, is a realistic period.
And can you give any guarantee that Article 48 would be used?
No, I think it's clear from my evidence that the European institutions would have to make a choice between one and the other, and it's not for me as a private citizen to give any kind of guarantee on that.
Yes. Could you give... Can I continue? The opt-outs which the UK at the moment enjoys, such as, for example, the rebate and some justice opt-outs and the Schengen and these sort of things, do you consider that Scotland would still be able to enjoy these, for example, the rebate?
Well, the rebate's not an opt-out. It's something else. And as I've said repeatedly in the written evidence that I presented, I think that in both technical and political terms would be the most difficult question. Let me put my point another way, because I insisted that we need to address here the question of interests. Obviously, it's not in the interests of the other 27 member states for Scotland's membership of the European Union to cost €1 more, and they might like to find a way where it costs a few euros less. So I think you can be sure that on this question of the budget rebate, the other member states would pay very close attention, and it wouldn't just be a question of what London could agree with Edinburgh. For the opt-outs, that's for membership of the Eurozone and membership of the Schengen zone, it's rather clear to me that, first of all, the other member states would be very reluctant to give Scotland an opt-out if it asked for one, and secondly, an opt-out isn't necessary. there's no way the European Union can oblige new members either to join the euro or the Schengen zone.
Another point which was made at last week's session was that if Article 48 is used, it could open a Pandora's box for other countries. For example, you mentioned fisheries. At the moment, it's in fact the common fisheries policy which keeps most of the Spanish fishermen out of the North Sea. They would presumably be looking to get into the North Sea, or they might well be. If Scotland can tie about with the treaties or the UK on their behalf can tie about with the treaties under Article 48, is it not possible that other countries would want to do the same thing?
Well, you're quite right to say that other countries like Spain might want to profit, so to speak, from Scotland's independence and membership to gain something. But on the specific question that you ask, it's not the treaty that lays down the common fisheries policy, and not the quotas and so on. They're decided from year to year or every X years in the Council of Ministers. And Scotland, on joining the European Union, would, in accordance with the traditional method, Scotland would adopt the acquis as it exists on the day of accession. And the acquis as it exists on the day of accession is, in the case of fisheries, what's decided.
That's equal access to a common resource, isn't it?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. Excuse me.
Well, in terms of fisheries, I think the original acquis says equal access to a common resource.
I don't know the fisheries policy by heart, excuse me, but I think perhaps the answer to the question is that, as far as I can understand, the policy of the Scottish Government is to accept the common fisheries policy and make it better.
I'm fine.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Avery, you talked about and alluded to whether it would be the interests of the EU to have Scotland as an independent member, but we do face sort of two futures going forward in this area, in that potentially we have an independent Scotland with a clear directive about wanting to stay in Europe, or the possibility of an in-out referendum in the UK. And I wonder if you would be willing to give an opinion on where you see Scotland's interest would be, given the possibility that we could be out of the EU, given a no vote, and then a vote to come out of the UK in a referendum.
Gosh, this is a double hypothetical, isn't it? If the Scottish people vote for independence and if the Conservative Party wins the next election, I'm not going to take a position on that. But let me try and answer your question, which is manifestly, if after the next Westminster election there is a process of renegotiation leading up to an in-out referendum on British membership, it complicates the situation. I mean, obviously it does. Whether it works against or for the interests of independent Scotland is not so easy to draw the balance. I mean, some people might say that an independent Scotland with, let's say, a more positive attitude to the European Union than London might be more welcome. Some people might say, for heaven's sake, let's deal with this British question before we deal with the Scottish question. So I think the truth is that that scenario would introduce an element of complication, which is very difficult to predict the results in advance.
Would you be willing to venture an opinion as to whether it's in the long-term interests of Scotland in either scenario to be part of the EU?
That's a tricky one, isn't it? I think I won't answer that question.
That's fine.
Okay, as is your privilege. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Mr Avery. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the clarity and the brevity in your submission. It's a very difficult issue for not only for the public, but sometimes for the members to get their heads around, and I certainly appreciated the clarity and brevity of the evidence that you've provided us in writing. You confirmed earlier that you think the 18-month timetable is perfectly realistic, and I think you mentioned the Finland experience from the point of beginning to negotiate the treaty to having the treaty signed was a matter of 13 months, and I think that would certainly give encouragement to people like myself who support Scotland's case for independence and remaining within the European Union as we move towards that. I wanted to ask you, though, what you think about the British government's position in those negotiations from September the 19th, this year onwards, if Scotland votes yes. Do you think, and you've said in paragraph 5 in your submission, that the British government would represent Scotland in those negotiations from that point to independence? I'm wondering what you think of the British government's position at the moment, where they refuse to enter into any negotiations or discussions with the Scottish Government in preparing that possibility, in preparing that ground. Do you think it's realistic that the United Kingdom Government is doing no work whatsoever at the moment on this matter, and that on September the 19th they assume the driving seat and begin negotiations only from that point onwards?
Well, I mean, I don't believe it's true they're not doing any work on the matter. They may be sharing it with you to a very limited extent, but I think they're certainly thinking about it in London. I mean, they're handling this question professionally. Between now and the referendum, there's an important element of tactics related to the fact, as we well know, the main parties of Westminster are against Scottish independence. If and when the result of the referendum is in favour of an independent Scotland, then it seems to me perfectly clear that the Westminster government and the Whitehall machine will move into action very smartly to try and find a reasonable solution to the consequences. And how can I pay? I must be a bit diplomatic here, but as I think I said somewhere, you shouldn't, when you prepare for this kind of negotiation, you should listen to what the other party's saying, but you should spend a good deal of time analysing what the interests are. And I repeat that a situation where Scotland was outside the European Union, not applying EU laws, would be a legal nightmare for the people, for the rest of the United Kingdom, and the British government has to take account of that. Now, I think you asked a question which was slightly different about the way in which the British government would represent Scotland during the period between the referendum and independence, and what would be their position, what would be their motives. And, you know, it is going to be, it would be quite difficult for them, because on one and the same time, the Westminster government would be representing the United Kingdom as a whole, but in prospect it would be representing the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that's what they call, in moral philosophy, a deontological problem. But I'd like to give a concrete answer, which goes like this. I worked in the European Commission in these kind of accession negotiations, where technically the European Commission was and is the servant of the 28 member states vis-à-vis the third country. But we always took the view that it was also the responsibility of the European Commission to take account of the future new member, and that therefore any decent and intelligent approach to this kind of negotiation takes account not only of the existing responsibilities, but the future responsibilities. And I rather hope that the people in Westminster and Whitehall would understand that they have no interest in making things more difficult than necessary for a future independent Scotland. Not that they make it easy for you, but I repeat, I think it would be very, very unfortunate for the rest of the United Kingdom if Scotland was not a member on day one of independence.
So it's in the UK's interests also, as I think you've said a few times, for those negotiations to be initiated and commenced as quickly as possibly can be, with everyone's interests at stake. But could you just confirm what you said there, that it's your opinion that the British government is currently working on the possibilities for Scottish independence, but isn't really sharing it with anyone?
I'm just guessing. I don't talk to them about
with
it. But having worked in the Whitehall machine, I can tell you they plan quite carefully. So.
Important point for me, because on September the 19th, after a yes vote, the British government does assume that responsibility, and in expecting them to be prepared for that, I would hope that they're not starting with a blank sheet on September the 19th. They must surely have been working up plans and proposals, if not discussing with the Scottish Government, but at least doing it internally within the departments at Whitehall to prepare this ground. And so I suppose really what I'm asking finally on this point is, would it not be in their common interests, the United Kingdom's interests and Scotland's interests, for discussion and negotiation to take place with the Scottish Government now on the matter?
Madam Convener, I'm not going to respond yes or no to that question. Forgive me, but it's a political question and I'm not going to take a position.
Okay, that's fair enough. Could I turn to the point that you mentioned in your opening contribution to us about the prospect of Scotland being pushed out of the European Union only to have to renegotiate its way back in, and you described that as absurd, the absurdities of that possibility. Could you expand on that a wee bit, please, and tell us some of the absurdities that could occur if that scenario were to unfold? I think you mentioned the fisheries policy as one example, but could you expand for us on what some of the absurdities might be if that were to happen?
I think I also describe it as a legal nightmare, with Scotland outside the European Union not applying EU rules and the rest of the United Kingdom, applying EU rules. It's not just about fisheries, but it's about the whole, what's the word, system of the single market, the network of trade and economics and all those things. Unless Scotland continues to apply EU rules, life becomes diabolically complicated for firms and citizens, not just in the rest of the UK, but in Germany, Spain, or wherever you like, as is well known. Citizens and firms in other member states than the United Kingdom have rights in Scotland, in virtue of Scotland being a member of the European Union. And if Scotland no longer applied the EU rules and no longer had the EU obligations, they would be in a right mess. Perhaps it would help you, Madam Convener, if I reflect a little bit on the solution which some people sometimes talk about to this problem of the interim period. And by the interim period, I'm talking about a period between Scottish independence and joining the European Union. I don't call it a transitional period because that's another concept. Of course, it would be possible, if necessary, to devise a relationship between Scotland and the European Union during such a period. In view of the risk of the legal nightmare, something would have to be done. And in fact, there already exists a template for that, and that's the European Economic Area. And I think you've examined that. Presently, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are in the European Economic Area. So maybe the European Union could offer the EEA as an interim measure to Scotland. But even that solution, according to me, is not so simple. First of all, people sometimes ignore the fact that to join the EEA, you first of all have to join EFTA. And although I guess our Norwegian friends wouldn't say no, they've got to be consulted about that. Second, the EEA in its present form doesn't cover all the single market. Agriculture and fisheries are excluded. And I guess some member states, including the rest of the United Kingdom, wouldn't be too keen on the prospect of Scotland being outside that and outside the common fisheries policy for a few years. Although in Scotland, I understand that might be popular. Third, and this follows from the other point, customs controls could be necessary for these agricultural and fisheries products during this interim period. I mean, vis-à-vis Norway, we exercise the right to restrict the imports of fisheries products. Next, in the EEA, and this is a more political point, in the EEA, as I know you well understand, you have no effective say in the institutions, in the decisions taken by Brussels, although you still have to accept a lot of those decisions. And I think this would be quite difficult for the Parliament of an independent Scotland to swallow, although, of course, as you know, the Norwegians have swallowed it. Finally, of course, even in such an interim period, you wouldn't have any certainty of the date of Scotland's membership under Article 49. So for me, these alternative ideas which people talk about for the interim period are not very convincing, and candidly, from the point of view of the legal ingenuity needed to put them in place, it would be just as complicated as putting in place an accession treaty from day one. Probably more complicated.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Amy McGregor.
Oh, thank you. Well, just on the basis of what you said about if we had an independent Scotland, the sort of question I'm being asked by constituents is that if Scotland was independent and hopefully, I would hope, would somehow be a member of the European Union, but didn't get the UK rebate, which I think appears to be highly likely, would it be more expensive for Scotland to be a member of the European, as she would presumably be a net contributor, would it be more expensive for Scotland to be a member of the European Union than it is at the moment?
I think the simple answer to your question is this. First, Scotland should expect to be, and I think accepts to be, a net contributor. In relative terms, Scotland is relatively rich, so it would be a net contributor.
Ireland is, for example.
I can predict confidently there will be a net contributor. The second answer is that I can't answer the question what the result of these budgetary negotiations would be. I've said repeatedly, it would be one of the most difficult and important aspects of the negotiation. I couldn't prejudge the result.
Do you have a view on the currency? What sort of currency would we need? I mean, would Scotland have to use the euro?
No, I think I've said already that even if you accept the basic treaties, which say in principle you accept economic and monetary union, in practice no new member state is permitted to join the euro on accession, and if you don't want to join the euro, there's no way that the European Union can or would oblige you to do so. People sometimes say, yes, but you need an opt-out, to which I think the simple answer is Sweden doesn't have an opt-out, and nobody has suggested that Sweden is behaving in contradiction of European rules.
But am I not right in thinking that Croatia is being forced to join the euro?
No, Croatia has accepted in the basic treaties, in principle, to join the euro, but in practice, Croatia, like every other member state, will join the euro if and when it's ready to do so.
Is there not a date set for that?
No, absolutely not. You have to complete the complicated series of criteria that you have to meet. I think there are 4 or 5 different criteria, some of which are purely voluntary on the part of the member state concerned. Excuse me, I don't think I should go more deeply into this euro question, but it's quite plain to me that the Swedish case is a very simple answer to the question, can you be a member state and not apply the euro if you don't have an opt-out? That's the case of Sweden.
Thank you.
Campbell.
Just if I may, just turning back to this question of the use of the word absurd. Just for the record, I think Sir David Edward last week suggested that as far as the gap between the vote for independence and the moment of separation is concerned, my point is during that period there will be an obligation to negotiate a solution that does not lead to the absurd result that is being suggested. Presumably you would agree with that.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, it's a question of, and also Aidan O'Neill suggested not only...
Excuse me, I can't easily hear what you're saying.
Oh, sorry.
Do forgive me.
Yeah, no, I was just quoting from the evidence Sir David Edward gave last week in terms of the necessity to negotiate a solution to avoid absurd results of Scotland somehow being out of the European Union at the point of independence.
Look, he's arguing from a legal point of view. I'm not a lawyer. I argue from the point of view of, as an ex-practitioner, from the point of view of interest. And I persist in saying that it's against the interest of the other member states for Scotland not to be a member on day one of independence.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a quick final question, Mr Avery, if you could just indulge us a wee bit. We have a view from President Barroso and President Van Rompuy and the statements that they made, and I'm just wondering if you could give your opinion on their opinion that Article 49 would be the way to go, whereas you're quite firmly in the Article 48 camp. Oh, there's Patricia Martin. Yeah. She's never let me know. Sorry, if we could hear Mr Avery's answer, please.
In fact, Madam Convener, I do discuss that question on page 2 of my written evidence. As you can imagine, I try to be quite diplomatic in this matter. But let me just say that I've, in my analysis, what Mr Barroso and Mr Van Rompuy have said is true, but it's not the whole truth. I sometimes say that it's a sort of litany which they repeat, you know. They say exactly the same thing in the legal text which has been prepared for them. And I describe it sometimes as elliptical. Elliptical means the meaning is rather obscure and partly hidden. So let me put my point another way. If you asked someone, a travel agent, the best way to get from Edinburgh to Brussels, and the agent said, well, first of all, you should take a flight to Oslo, spend a few nights there, and then take another flight to Brussels, you couldn't say that was false, but it's not very helpful and certainly not the complete story. So I think there's an element missing in these replies, and it's not insignificant that although President Barroso has been asked in the European Parliament to comment on the use of Article 48, he's refrained entirely from commenting on Article 48.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Patricia, I didn't realise that you'd wanted in, so...
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Mr Avery. If I could just ask then a supplementary on the Convener's last question there. In your paper, you quote the comments by Mr Van Rompuy and Mr Barroso, who have said that if part of the territory of a member state would cease to be part of that state because it was to become a new independent state, the treaties would no longer apply to that territory. And then it goes on to say, in other words, a new independent state would have to become a third country with respect to the EU. Now, you suggest that's not, well, it is the truth, but it's not the whole truth, and that if the treaties were adjusted in an appropriate manner in advance of independence, then they could apply to the new state, and therefore Article 48 could be used. But isn't that the point, that Mr Barroso and Mr Van Rompuy are clearly saying that Article 48 would not be an option and that Article 49 would be the methodology that would apply?
Plainly, that's the widespread impression that has been created, and I think you ought to ask Mr. Barroso and Mr. Van Rompuy themselves what exactly they mean. I limit myself to saying that I read with interest the written evidence that you received from Mr. Pires. He made a number of arguments in favour of Article 49, some of which I found less than convincing, but he concluded as a lawyer that the use of Article 48 would be incorrect. He didn't say it would be inapplicable, and therefore I persist, like Sir David Edward, in considering that Article 48 would be applicable, and I confidently predict that in the scenario we're discussing, if there's a yes in the referendum, the European institutions would consider whether or not to use it.
I think you would concede that both President Van Rompuy, or Mr Van Rompuy rather, and Mr Barroso are very experienced politicians. And if, as you say, the impression has been given that Article 49 would be the correct use, do you not think that that's the impression that they wish to give, because that's where they see this matter going?
I don't think I should interpret what they think they were trying to say. I limit myself to saying that the replies which have been given to these questions about Scottish independence are incomplete replies.
And Mr Barroso and Mr Van Rompuy have said that this is not the end of the matter. They've said that we haven't told you the whole story. They've given us a part answer. I think they both thought they were being quite specific on that issue.
No, it's quite interesting that from time to time Mr Barroso, for example, says that he's not in a position to reply to a hypothetical question.
Indeed.
And there's a certain, what should I say, difference between saying you won't reply to a hypothetical question and then replying to it. So in my opinion, the use of Article 48 is still a possibility.
I'm sure it is a possibility. My assertion would be that both these senior members have, in effect, ruled it out with their comments. However, let's move on to the issue of the rebate, if we may. I wonder if you think it would be possible, as the Scottish Government asserts it would be, for Scotland to have the same rebate as the UK currently has.
Could you just repeat, would it be possible for Scotland to
the Scottish
have
Government has
the same rebate?
That it would have the same rebate. Do you think that's a certainty? Do you think it's a possibility?
No, I've said already that I can't guarantee, and I find it difficult to predict the result of the complicated budgetary negotiation which would take place between London, Edinburgh and the other member states. Excuse me, but I don't want to venture into territory where I can't guarantee a result.
Okay. Well, from your experience, do you think that that would be a difficult negotiation to have?
Oh yes, these negotiations about money are always difficult and tough.
And other
the
member
negotiations
states?
on the British rebate were very tough negotiations.
Indeed.
And I think it's rather clear that if it comes to a negotiation between Westminster and Edinburgh about these budgetary questions, Westminster is likely to be tough.
And the negotiations that would ensure Scottish membership of the EU, if they were predicated on the rebate being retained in the form it currently is in, would that make those negotiations harder and longer?
I think that's for you in Scotland to decide as a political question.
I was asking from your experience of negotiation whether that was the kind of issue that would make those negotiations more difficult and make them longer of duration than perhaps a request not to have the rebate would have.
I've already given my opinion in my written evidence that the most difficult element in these negotiations would be about the budgetary questions. But I don't think that requires more than 18 months and could be done in considerably shorter time.
I asked the question, Convener, because looking at the table we have in front of us, it's clear to me that the shortest period of time that has passed between the end of accession negotiations and accession is 9 months. In some other examples, it's many years. So after these complicated negotiations take place, we would have a minimum of 9 months between that point and accession, which seems to me to be extremely tight.
Yes, it's a tight timetable, but where there's a will, there's a way. And if it's a fact, which I believe to be a fact, that it's not in the interest of any member state to create this hiatus between Scottish independence and Scottish membership, I think they do it rather quickly. And don't forget that, how can I explain? We're talking about ratification by 27 other member states.
Indeed.
They're not doing it consecutively, they're doing it simultaneously. So in effect, the length of time depends on the slowest. The slowest is usually the Belgians because they've got at least 3, if not 5 parliaments.
Indeed.
But I think the Belgians would do it in time.
It's very interesting, thank you.
Very, very quick supplementary, Rod Campbell.
Just for a piece of clarification which you might be able to help us with. The President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, and the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, their term of office ends when? Are you able to confirm when their term of office ends?
Yeah, I think is it September or October this year? Quite soon.
So as individuals, they might not well be involved in crucial further discussions.
I'm not going to say anything about the future career of these two respected gentlemen.
Okay.
Convener, could I just develop a little bit more a point I made earlier about is it a good thing or a bad thing for the European Union? Okay.
A few more minutes, but not a lot of time left. So.
Okay. Anyway, I tried to put this question on a sort of more general level. Is it a good thing or a bad thing for the European Union if a member state divides into 2 independent states and both of them remain in the European Union? I tried to make abstraction from the specific case of Scotland and to consider in a more general way. And it's not much use asking here what's the policy of the European Union towards this situation, towards independentism, if I may call it that. There's nothing in the treaties that prevents member states altering the geographical definition of their territory. It's happened quite a lot of times. I mean, Algeria left France and left the European communities. Greenland left Denmark. East Germany joined. So, in brief, there's nothing in the treaties that sanctifies the geographical definition of the member states. So I think it's fair to say that on this question of independentism, the European institutions, their policy is not to have a policy. To be more precise, their policy is to respect the constitutional arrangements of member states. And it seems to me that the case we're examining, where the EU continues to have the same number of citizens but one more member state, it has quite a limited effect on the operation of the European Union as such. It doesn't alter the influence of the EU in world affairs. Its number of population, its economic weight remains the same. You could even argue that it's a plus for the European Union to have an additional seat in the United Nations and other international organizations. On the other hand, you could argue that it's a minus because decision-making becomes more complicated every time you add a new member, although this hasn't stopped the European Union enlarging successively. So I just want to say that on balance, I think it's difficult to argue that independentism, member state splitting, is bad for the European Union as such. Of course, another way of addressing this question is to consider whether the European Union prefers big or small states. And of course, it doesn't have a policy on that. It has an institutional setup which tries to balance the interests of big and small states. But in that context, the institutional framework, it's quite clear that the EU favours in certain ways small states. As you know, through this principle of digressive proportionality, smaller states get a bigger voice in the institution and their population would justify. And it's also clear that the number of small states in the European Union has continually increased. It's now got 20 states with less than 12 million people, and of those 20 states, 9 have less than 5 million. So I simply want to say that I don't think one can sustain the argument that independentism is of itself a bad thing for the functioning of the European Union. I think it's neutral. Thank you.
We're well over our deadline taken. I thank you on behalf of the committee, Mr Avery, for your evidence today. Like all our other witnesses in this committee inquiry, we come up with sometimes more questions than answers, but thank you today for your answers, and we really appreciate you coming along to committee. Now, before we move into private session on agenda item 3, we'll have a brief recess, and if the winners of the competition can stay back, you're going to get to meet the committee as your prize, and a photograph as well. So, following the recess, we'll go into private session.